Not going to lie, to call this an impulse buy would be a massive understatement, but the thrill of being a vampire has always intrigued me. Granted, I'm a werewolf kind of person at heart, but vampires have always had so many powers and abilities for storytellers to play around with. Immortality, superhuman strength, mind control, the sky's the limit. Seriously, whenever someone's talking about vampires versus werewolves, I gotta stick with my guy, but the game was kinda rigged from the start. So when Vampyr advertised itself as a true good old-fashioned vampire game, I had to try it out for myself. Let's zero in on Vampyr. Also, it goes without saying, if you have looked around my channel for a while, you can assume I have a more fanciful preference for my vampires. But it should be fine, right? Right?
What is song but a call to arms? What is hate but jilted love? What is life but death pending?
I am very outside my element here. The story begins in 1981's London, a very peaceful time in our history with no suffering, no needless deaths, and no broken families. And our protagonist, Jonathan Reed, has just returned from the front lines where he worked as a surgeon only to be attacked by a vampire and dropped into a mass grave. Off to a wonderful start, game, but seeing that this is called Vampyr, we already know what's about to happen. Jonathan rises from the grave as a freshly starved vampire, seeking out the only thing that can sustain him, and quickly finds his first victim. After killing his first victim, staggering around town, and resting till the next night, Jonathan starts exploring to find out exactly what he has become and why this is happening. Exploring the town this early in the game doesn't really bring very much except some oddly past conversations, or more accurately interrogations, more on that later, until he comes across an interesting character that seems to be knowledgeable on vampires.
Slowly, vampire. Who are you?
Oh shit! The power of Christ compels you, bitch!
Saith the vampire. Present yourself.
I don't know what he was expecting. Fast forward a few missions because this is a very plot-heavy game, and you now work for the Pembroke Hospital using his surgeon credentials as a perfect cover-up while he searches throughout a vampire-infested town, seeking the meaning for him being turned into a vampire and a cure for the disease running rampant in London that turns people aggressive and feral. Perhaps it's turning people into some form of vampire. Nah, that's crazy talk. Vampyr's story was okay to me. The premise was awesome, being a vampire doctor who effectively held the lives of all the citizens in the palm of his hand. I can sense all of you scurrying around like rats. But there were a couple of areas where something was just lacking. It was hard to take the game seriously throughout the entire game, as so many characters just seemed to ignore an obvious vampire plague. I mean, you can save a trashy landlord from having his face ripped off by a vampirized tenant, and without questioning it, will simply assume, oh, I guess the guy just hated the rates. The game also had a few mystical elements in it. Yeah, big shocker, I know, but I do find it hard to understand how the main character tries to use science to solve the game's plot once you throw in a bunch of magic mumbo jumbo, unless I guess he just happened to study magic theory during his stay in the military. I don't know how this stuff works. Interacting with NPCs also felt a bit stilted, with every interaction feeling like a series of disconnected Q&As, like you were interviewing someone rather than talking to them.
So, may I ask you a few questions? Do you know Nurse Dorothy Crane? But you don't seem happy living in Whitechapel. Why don't you just leave this place? How do you I'm fine.
Technically speaking, this is what you are doing as a player, but the game is supposed to give the illusion of an actual conversation, not a literal checklist. On a more positive note, there are a lot of characters with deep lore and plenty to discover through communicating with them, although some characters are less deep than others. They don't just interact with you though, they also have conversations with each other, and while some of the dialogue is simple filler, some convey key information about the characters that do have in-game benefits. Honestly, the NPCs are one of the biggest factors in this game, and a lot of the time will be spent with them, so it's good they generally got them right. But one thing does stick out to me. They fucked up the subtitles. As with any game, not every character will be as engaging as some others, and while normally a player could simply read the subtitles as they skip past the voice portions, Vampyr's subtitles are actually broken up so that only portions of a character's dialogue is shown at a time, and attempting to skip will result in the player missing part of the subtitles.
Since the criminal nature of your job means you could be arrested, are you not afraid of what would happen to your boy if you were?
No one will ever take my son away from me.
Since the criminal nature of...
No one will ever take my son away from me.
Are you not afraid of what would happen to your boy?
And on that note of more UI-based complaints, the fact that looting anything with more than 3 items causes the character to play the coin sound multiple times over, even after walking away, is something that I think should be tweaked in a patch. On the more visual side of things, by now you must have noticed all of my gameplay so far has been in night stages. Well, get used to that, because this entire game is one big night stage. I guess the developers thought that daytime is pretty much downtime for any vampire game that does not explicitly find a loophole around the whole burn up in the light thing. So they simply decided to omit that part altogether, which I can understand. It also adds to the very dark and dreary feel of the environment. If you were looking for a more bright and upbeat vampire experience, this is not one of them. People are dying in the street, the supposed vampire hunters are harassing just as many innocents as they are the guilty, and the war has taken a toll on everyone's psyche, including the main character. Speaking of not happy games, I do find it kinda interesting how some sources advertise the game as being able to kill anyone, but in reality, much like any other game, there are plot-related characters that cannot be engaged, much less killed, because otherwise it would obviously break the story. I actually don't want to give this game points off for that, because it did later clarify that some characters can only be killed through story, mainly just pointing it out in case anyone had the expectation of the game going for the monumental task of a branching narrative that allowed key characters to be killed. That's not happening here. Despite the main story being linear, there are events in the game that can play out differently. Depending on the character's actions, some minor like dialogue changes, but others are more expansive, like changing a neutral area into a vampire-infested hellscape. How was I supposed to know making the guy a vampire was a bad thing, people? I'm sorry. The condition of the town itself is linked to the health of its citizens, and every time you go to sleep, which in this game is tied to leveling, the epidemic gets worse, with sick citizens progressing to worse illnesses, and the streets filling up more and more with hostile enemies. Funny enough, I didn't actually progress the epidemic all that much, but don't get it twisted, I got a lot of people killed. Throughout my playthrough, since I didn't really feel the need to level up all that much, something I'll talk about in gameplay coming up shortly, I ended up completing large swaths of the game in what was effectively a single, really busy night.
The cats nestle close to their kittens. The lambs have laid down with the sheep. You're cozy and warm in your bed, my dear. Please go the fuck to sleep.
The game basically gave me exactly what I expected from it thematically, a dark and gritty post-war London with vampires filling it to the brim and plenty of string instruments trailing behind you just waiting for you to get into a dangerous situation.
There you are, you stinking bilge rat!
The story did feel a bit melodramatic for me, but what can I say? I've already laid out my preferences here, so when I say that this is a moderately compelling story and a beautiful game, that is saying something, even though the game is a bit predictable and a fair bit gloomy. If I was lazy, I would make some sort of Dark Souls comparison, but that would be a fruit so low it's actually on the ground. So I'm gonna go in a different direction and open up with the dialogue system. Not super exciting, but actually really important to the game. In Vampyr, you will be spending a lot of time talking to people, and I mean a lot of time, investigating many various topics and locations while also learning more about the person you are talking to. Even if you don't particularly care about a character, talking to them can unlock quests, maybe give you information on another character, and most importantly, make them just that much more delicious when you finally decide to snack on their neck. As you would expect, drinking blood is the key to growing stronger as a vampire, but the game throws in an interesting twist into the formula with their EXP system. Every NPC has a bar to represent how much experience you will gain by draining their blood, But this bar does not start out full. Instead, it gradually fills the more you learn about the potential victim and the healthier they are. This is an interesting idea as it comes with a moral conundrum. Sure, you can try to min-max EXP gain like a respectable gamer, learning more about the characters, helping them out, etc, etc. But at least for some people, this will end up humanizing these fictional characters and making the decision to consume them a bit harder. Or you could be like me, come home from a bad day at work and start eating people at random. And then I learned my actions do affect the ending. You don't have to eat people though. As a doctor, you can actually try to do the opposite and diagnose their illnesses and prescribe a cure to them. Makes them tasty later. Now sadly there isn't any complex minigame to emulate any sort of medical practice outside of one awesome scene, a missed opportunity by the way.
He's not convulsing, he's choking. He's not getting any air. Scalpel! Hand me that scalpel!
What can I do, Doctor?
But we got crafting. I mean, it does kind of make sense, the character is a scientist, but game, you still have me rummaging through people's drawers and trash cans like a drug addicted kleptomaniac. And where there is crafting, there is always going to be upgrading, and in this game, I do like the little touch they added onto the standard collect upgrade item shtick. Here, every time you level up a weapon, you also pick a perk to go with it. These perks are weapon specific, and while rather minor, they do add up, encouraging different playstyles for each weapon. While the selection of weapons is fairly average, there are a bunch of unique named weapons that can only be obtained via quest or embracing NPCs. I didn't see any super unique effects attached to the ones in my playthrough, but it does get the job done for collectibles. Combat itself is interesting, and it took me a while to really wrap my head about how I felt about it, but now I can say with certainty that it's kinda dull. Now I say kinda because the attributes of a good combat system are there. Hits feel like they have some weight to them. Enemies keep you on your toes with attacks that need to be parried / dodged. Did you say parry? And there is even a stun bar on enemies, so there is more to consider than just whack them until they fall over and don't get up. But it all just kind of feels half done. The mechanics work, but as I played around more, I grew more annoyed by the combat. And while I've heard people compare the gameplay to you know what,
Looks like it's gonna be the Dark Souls of weather!
it lacks the handcrafted enemy placements, the combat variety, the nuanced weapon specifics, and a lot of other things that make for good compelling combat. But hey, two-handed weapon allows you to parry, so praise the sun god. The boss battles in the game range from boring to awesome, with most of the good ones happening later into the game so I can't show you, but the boring ones really do fall flat.
Show me your power, newborn!
If anything is to blame for only okay combat outside of uninteresting enemies, it has to be the skill system. When I did my first impression of the game, I do remember saying that I hoped there were more skills to play around with down the line. There aren't. The skills do rank up and become more powerful, even branching off into 2 different evolutions, but at least to me, the branches aren't really all that impressive, which is alarming with such a small skill pool. Okay, so I like dark skills, right? So immediately my mind zeroed in onto the Shadow Mist move, and initially it pulls darkness below your feet before detonating it. Pretty cool if not hard to hit. But then I saw the evolution of it being a constant pool of shadows, ripping the blood out of your enemies and giving it to you, and I was sold. Turns out though, the radius of the skill does not increase, so while I had envisioned blanketing the ground in darkness with a mastered Shadow Mist and dueling my enemies while passively feeding onto their blood, the reality was my character dancing around a kiddie pool of darkness as enemies walked in and out of the damn thing. Other skills are pretty okay with the exception of the bite, which of all things required all the investment in the world to be a good move, but my biggest disappointment goes to the ultimates, which while looking nice the first couple of times, don't even evolve visually throughout the game, only getting a damage boost. That would be fine if it wasn't both the capstone of your build and a full cinematic experience. Once you have broken the back of 20 enemies, you have broken the back of 200 enemies. I mean, at max level, this move should be breaking the back, then the neck, then whatever else your target would rather not have broken, but instead you get the same animation for your entire playthrough. Oh, and you can be killed during the animation.
Oh my god! Stop!
So clearly I have my complaints with the combat system. It's not annoying enough to drag the entire game down, since at the end of the day it gets the job done, but luckily enough, the Vampyr gameplay overall, and by vampire I mean the mythical creature, not the name of the game, it was really good. If you don't like combat, or maybe you're going for a pacifist build forsaking any NPC blood, you can simply rank up the Shadow Veil skill to wrap yourselves in shadows for stealth mode. Or hey, if you are dealing with low ranking vampire hunters who are kinda green, you can simply turn up your collar and keep on walking. Combine that with the ability to teleport onto certain high areas and a blood vision that is both good for finding enemies and spying on questionable NPCs. And you do get an enjoyable Denizen of the Night experience, even if almost everything I just pointed out did have a flaw or two of its own. But there's one thing I think the game really should consider patching out, and that is the auto-save system. I understand the point of the game is that your choices matter or other somewhat pretentious feeling reasons, but outside of the obvious let players play your game the way they want, I have heard people complain that the autosave ended up messing up their game, bugging out and getting them stuck. Now personally, the game was roughly smooth from start to finish, a few alt-tab issues and only one crash, but in almost all my play that was about it. But still, hashtag right to save. Now I think I've talked about the gameplay enough, so it's about time to wrap this up with my final thoughts.
Done. He'll live. And now what? We fight. Killing is a hell of a lot easier than healing.
Vampyr is, like I said, not something that would normally appeal to me, but I was really intrigued with the idea of a good vampire simulator, not just some optional transformation thrown into a game, but something dedicated to the concept. Now, Vampyr doesn't fully do that, with some aspects of vampiredom limited to only scripted events like mind control, creating thralls, and dealing with the sun, but otherwise I think it gets most of the key aspects down. Running around in 1918's London did feel genuine and authentic, at least to a historically challenged person like myself.
What year is it?
And the gothic visuals weren't half bad. My biggest issue with this game has to come down to the combat actively reducing my desire to explore, and a bit of UI troubles. The dialogue is a bit too wordy for my taste if we're delving into the realms of complete subjectivity, but even then, that only really applies to characters I didn't care about, and if it wasn't for the damn subtitles, I could have simply sped through. Even though I have my own gripes with the combat overall, I have to say that every aspect of Vampyr does everything adequately, but always has that one thing that keeps me from saying it's great, whether that be the clarity for when you need to spy on people, the dialogue sounding like a checklist, or even the hideouts, which I had forgot to mention in this review because they're basically glorified breakpoints where you can resupply and level up, but even though there are plenty of them sprinkled around the map, I only ended up using the ones directly connected in populated areas, because the game does not encourage using them. This is not a stealth game where I need to hide away from people for extended periods of time. All those factors put together though, are the reason that Vampyr with a price of $49.99 gets a sale plus in my mind. You don't need any sort of big discount to justify buying this title, but I think straight up $50, I don't know about that. Obviously this goes up if you are a big Vampyr fan, but only to a buy because, man, I can't give a steal recommendation to a game that's combat actively made me desire to do something else. Unless you're an RPG, but that's a topic for another day. Either way, check out some of my other videos for more gaming content, mostly of a more anime inclination, though not always. Consider donating to my Patreon if you like these kind of reviews, and I'll see you guys next time with a review of Hakoniwa Explorer Plus. Yeah, getting back to my comfort zone there. Peace!